Greetings, class. This is the last one of the series of videos on constitutional law. In this last one, I just want to briefly touch upon, let's see, what is it? Due process. I'm sorry. I want to touch on due process and also equal protection. Again, this is quite short. One of the issues that arises when you're talking about constitutional law is how certain rights are protected. If government deprives you of certain rights, the Constitution requires not only that government be careful about what rights you're being deprived of, but also about how those rights are deprived. So if you think of it in terms of like constitutional law, I'm sorry, criminal law, what you have is two different aspects. One is the crime the person is charged with, and that would be the substantive law. The other aspect is the process by which that person is charged and ultimately tried and either convicted or found not guilty. So the process is what's called procedural due process. And the image that I have on the slide is an image to show you that there are maybe three, in this case, three steps to thinking. And the three steps would be you get the questions in your brain, you kind of mull those over, and then you come out with an idea. And that's what the image represents. That's the process of how you think, or how you're thinking. It's not the substantive what those thoughts are and whether those thoughts are even any good or not, or whether those thoughts are really meaningful or have any value. It's just the process of how do you do something? How does government deprive you of those rights? How does government take your property? That's what procedural due process is. So on the slide, I say procedural equals how. And then substantive due process is the what. That is, with substantive due process, you're looking at what is government taking, not how is government taking it, but what is government taking. And substantive due process applies to fundamental rights, such as the freedom of speech, for example. So taking that same example that I have, graphic that I have on the slide, then the substantive part would be, what are those questions? And what is that idea that comes out at the end? That's the distinction between those two. So as you read through them, sometimes there's a little bit of overlap, but if you read through them, you can get a better sense of this if you keep in mind the procedure is how they do it, and the substantive is what the government's taking. Next, I want to go through this scenario. It's the last one we'll have for this series of videos. Drinks R Us is a bar in small town that under Georgia law is not allowed to sell alcoholic beverages on Sunday. Georgia law prohibits the sale of alcohol on Sunday, and Georgia law permits cities and counties to allow stadiums and eating establishments that derive at least half of their gross sales from the sale of meals to sell alcohol on Sundays. Unlike its eating establishment competitors, Drinks R Us earns little income from food sales, so it cannot sell alcohol on Sunday. Dipsomaniac, the owner of Drinks R Us, argued that the law was unconstitutional because it treated his bar differently than the stadiums and other eating establishments. Georgia's legislature determined that this exception was permissible because it encouraged a recreational atmosphere on Sundays and that the health and safety risks of bars are greater. What should a court decide and why? Hint, look for cases deciding what standards are used for different areas of equal protection issues. So this scenario that I've given you is being challenged or raises the issue of equal protection. And the idea of equal protection is that those who are similarly situated should be treated the same under government rules. So the first question here is there any differential treatment? And the answer here is yes. Bars are being treated differently than restaurants that serve alcohol. And at its core, Dipsomaniac is arguing we both sell alcohol, so why should one be treated differently than the other? That's the core of his argument. So take a look in the chapter, look at the different equal protection issues and how they're addressed. Pause the video, jot down your own answer, and then we'll come back to it. See if you agree with the court. Okay, I forgot to put the answer here, but the court decided that the statute was constitutional, that it did not violate equal protection. Now, why is that? Isn't he being treated differently? Well, yes, he is. There are several different categories of areas where government can discriminate, can treat people differently. One of those areas is business or for commercial distinctions. Anything that's not part of the listed areas. And if someone is treated differently under the areas that don't get special protection, which I'll talk about in a minute, then the standard for whether the law was constitutional is just whether the state had a rational basis for doing what it did. In other words, did the state have a rational basis for treating bars differently than restaurants on Sunday? And the court said yes, the legislature had a rational basis. The legislature said that the difference in treatment was permissible because it encouraged a recreational atmosphere on Sundays, people going out to ball games and stadiums and all that, and that the health and safety risks of bars are greater based on the assumption that if someone's only drinking as opposed to someone eating and drinking, then the person who's only drinking is more likely to be unsafe to the public. Now, as long as the legislature gave a rational basis, that means basically any kind of reason for the differential treatment between one and another, then the courts are going to defer to the legislature. So the standard is just rational basis. Note that you might disagree with the Georgia legislature, right? I mean, how does the legislature know that it encourages a recreational atmosphere on Sundays to have stadiums selling alcohol? What's recreational about that necessarily? But the courts aren't going to go behind the scenes to try to figure out what it was the reason for the Georgia legislature's determination. As long as it seemed to have a reason, a rational basis, then the court will defer to the legislature and this statute would be held constitutional. In the last part of this, on the last slide of this video, I just want to briefly talk about the different types of equal protection claims that can be made. First of all, equal protection clause applies to government, so federal or state action. Different levels of scrutiny depend on which category is being treated differently. So what that means is that the court is looking at what government did to try to figure out whether the government had a good reason for treating people or entities differently. If it's an economic or a social welfare classification, and the economics, that would be the example that I gave you, drinks or us. If it's an economic justification, all the legislature has to provide is a rational basis, just a reason for the distinction, for the classification, for the difference. And as long as the legislature provides a reason, the courts defer to the legislatures. If, though, the distinctions are based on other categories, suspect categories, then the courts will examine much more carefully. And so if government passes a statute that treats people in a certain ethnic group differently than other ethnic groups, the court will use strict scrutiny to figure out whether the state or the federal government was right in making that distinction. But the difference with strict scrutiny is that the court examines it very, very carefully, looks at every aspect of it to see, was there really a good, not just a good reason, a great reason for distinguishing between people based on ethnic group or race or fundamental rights. Strict scrutiny is the toughest test the federal or state government has to comply with. That's because these categories are suspect. These are categories where the courts start out with the presumption, well, if you're going to distinguish on that basis, boy, we've got to really examine that to see if that's just the only way you can accomplish whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. And so the court will give a very tough examination of government action where there's difference in treatment based on race, ethnic group, fundamental rights. Then there's what they call the intermediate test. So you have rational basis on one end. It's just basically, yeah, if you give a reason, that's good enough. You have strict scrutiny on the other end of this continuum where the courts say, look, you have to have a really, 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 really good reason for distinguishing based on these categories. And then there's this intermediate test, which is substantially related test. And there the courts say, okay, government, if you're going to distinguish between people and treat them differently based on gender or legitimacy, then, and legitimacy refers to parents being married and whether you're going to treat a child differently because the parents were or were not married. If you're going to do that, you should have a good reason for it. Maybe you don't have to have the really, really, really good reason that you see under strict scrutiny, but you still need to have a good, solid reason, government, for distinguishing between people based on gender or distinguishing between people based on legitimacy. Okay, so I hope that these 3 videos help you understand the constitutional law chapter better. We'll talk about it and I'll have some course evaluations in a couple of weeks just to kind of see where you are and what other changes that maybe might help you with this class. Okay, thank you.